Great to be here with you all today. I really appreciate your time joining. And today, really, the topic we're going to be talking about is understanding and sharing the transformational value of HR initiatives. Have you ever struggled to secure business partner buy-in or stakeholder approval for an HR initiative or learning initiative? Do you ever get the sense that priorities between HR and the business just aren't aligned? You're not speaking the same language, you're not on the same page? Or do you think HR needs ever come in second to others' needs in the business in ways that just aren't appropriate or that are frustrating to you in your role? Have you ever developed a strong strategy, yet you struggle to get the support or budget necessary? In my role here at Degreed, I run a team of specialists that help do creative analysis to inform a committee of buyers to help make an informed decision, especially those that are in the business and in HR and in learning. And I get the joy to work with companies every day to talk about some of these concepts, some of these areas of value, some of the approaches that we tend to take that are also having these challenges. And so today, I want to spend some time kind of breaking the mold of at least what I see as a common approach on how HR initiatives are sold and communicated to others within the business and to other colleagues and other decision makers. And in terms of an introduction, my background is not in HR. It's not in learning, actually. Most of my formative years, as I guess I could say, were in consulting and in software development. Worked in management and strategy consulting across the world before and after my MBA. And I always include pictures of my family on these slides as a introductory element. We do that here internally at Degreed, and it's fun as well to do it externally. It helps add to the why, right, for at least me personally and how that connects to my work. But as we're starting here, I want to ask a poll question. So the first question, number one, I'd love to get a sense from you all how ready you are to calculate your HR initiatives' return on investment. We've listed just a handful of potential questions here. You're not ready at all. Hopefully you can see that on the pop-up or the right panel there. You're ready for an audience of like-minded peers. You're somewhat ready for a mixed audience. You're very ready for a mixed audience. And you've maybe even historically had good success in presenting to a mixed audience. So that's something you're quite confident in, or none of the above. I'll give you a moment to quickly answer that. I'd love to have your input here so I can get a sense of where we all are as a group. Leave this open for another few seconds. Okay, good. Now, I think the poll is closed now, so what we'll be doing, if you could, there's an opportunity, if you haven't yet, still go ahead and submit those. We can grab those answers as it's accumulating results. But here in a moment, we'll be able to discuss these to get a sense of where everybody falls. Okay, it looks like I see the results here. Most of us are in that I'm somewhat ready bucket for a mixed audience, so that's great news. But it looks like it's also skewed towards folks that are either not ready at all or ready for an audience of like-minded peers. So that's pretty similar, I think, to those that I interact with. So I'd love to, let's go on to the next slide here where I'll talk about the summary of what I'd like to cover today. So as a starting point, it feels to me like the people agenda is really increasingly the focus of many company initiatives. That has been driven by, of course, COVID dynamics, the great resignation, the great reskilling, some of these sort of phases we're going through, these buzzword phases, as well as ongoing mental health concerns and just the people focus. And it feels like as well we've never had access to more data, more tools related to every dimension of the worker experience. So it feels like, HR is a priority, but despite these advancements, it still seems like HR, and in particular L&D, often struggle to prove the impact or tell their story. So, it makes me wonder, why is that? And what I want to do today is challenge us to rethink our approach and how we tell the story to our stakeholders so they can help we can help them internalize the impact. Because I think fundamentally, one of the ways to think about this is rethinking our business case approach, rethinking the way we tell and frame value. That approach is data-driven persuasion, right? And a business case, data-driven persuasion, value studies, all of those are, in many cases, sometimes just as important as the strategy themselves. If you have a great plan and a difficult path to execution or no approval, then obviously you're not going to make any headway. So we have to balance these things as well. And so today, what we'll be covering is 4 areas: knowing our audience, adjusting our message, going deeper, and telling a story. You see, I don't feel like our challenge today is a lack of data. It's an issue with how we work with the data we already have to analyze it more deeply and to tell the story. So I think we have a translation problem in many cases between someone with maybe an HR background or L&D mindset to those broader or diverse mindsets across the business. And so where do we start with that? Well, we start to address that by knowing our audience. So let me explain what I mean by this. There's a quote that I saw recently that I really like, that is from a professor of communications at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And really the quote just says, everything you say and do should start with this question in the context of communications, right? Who or what do the people listening to me need, and what do I want them to know, to feel, or do after my interaction? And this kind of sounds obvious, I think, to many of us. And so I think at the risk of repeating things that are already clear to us, just that double-minded or that double question of who is my audience and what do they need? I think that's really important. And why do we need to know this? I'll go quickly through this, right? The challenge is it feels like many people don't know how to derive the best ROI or data on programs like this. And if they do, then they tend to calculate it through the lens and communicate it through the lens of their own disciplines, in their own language, their own terminology, their own priorities and incentives. This matters because it can accidentally or just naturally create a one-size-fits-all mindset to some of these analyses. And with that approach, if it makes sense to me, it will probably make sense to others. But I think that mindset inherently limits the effectiveness of the message, assuming everyone thinks like we do, which again is very natural and very common, but we have to fight that. So how do we fight that? Well, we need to think differently. We need to first identify our objective and be clear to ourselves with what we're trying to accomplish, and understand our audience. Who is my audience and what do they care about, as I mentioned a moment ago? This audience can be defined as the organization, the team, an individual, whatever sort of entity there is, and probably all of the above, in order to make sure that you're addressing your audience carefully. So speaking of audience, I'd love to take another poll moment and understand from you all who are the most challenging stakeholders to win over for these types of discussions that you might be dealing with today. Who do you think is the hardest to convince? Who do you think maybe is the most demanding or the most challenging? And I've included a few suggestions here. You can select many if necessary. Staff or end users, the CHRO, the learning organization, the technology organization, finance, operations, other business leaders. Or if you're able to, I'd love to hear from you on any others that you might have felt matter in the chat. So just another few moments, then we'll be addressing these. Okay, the results are compiling here. Okay, interesting. It looks like the leading option I see is the finance organization, the CFO. At 37% of us responded there. Also, the CEO was another 37%, interestingly. And then it looks like the third place was staff and end users, and then the fourth place would have been the operations team. So yeah, quite a bit of diverse answers, but again, pretty standard, pretty consistent with what we see here in terms of the different types of audiences. So what do I mean by adjust your message, right? Let me give you some examples of what that looks like for some of these different audiences from at least a learning lens perspective. So if we think about these 6 different audiences here, just some metrics, for example, to highlight a way to help communicate findings that illustrate value that would speak to the type of thing each audience is maybe more interested in. So number 1, staff, framing it as a discussion around better experience and providing stats to support that. We've improved learning-related staff survey results by a certain percentage while also shifting so much training from live to digital, right? The CHRO might care more about skills and the meta story around skills tracking and skills development. So tracking 5 strategic skill categories, we've exceeded our certifications by a certain percent. Understanding how they're motivated, what their incentives are, and their hopes and dreams and fears allow you to focus on what matters for them. CLO might care about digitizing more processes, allowing us to curate in hours versus days or weeks. The CIO might be more focused on risks, giving us an opportunity to remove technology redundancies or simplify the tech stack and reduce those security risks. Also, the CFO, reduce costs, right? Leveraging content and staff curation and other efficiencies can save a significant amount in course design costs. These are just individual examples, right? I think a well-curated argument would have multiple supports. And then lastly, this example around higher customer satisfaction. We improved Net Promoter Score by a certain percent through upskilling our critical networking technologies, for example. Now, I think it's important to understand each of these messages, but not necessarily tell everything to everybody, right? It's almost like a bed of nails where if you try to tell everything to everybody, you won't actually break through. You won't penetrate anything. You won't make a point versus like a spear, right, with a singular point, a thoughtful, precise, pinpoint argument. And you'll notice even the language that we use often, make a point, precise, pinpoint. That's very, literally derived in many cases from actually breaking through, in these types of settings. So think about the audience, think about what they need, what they want, think about how, what they're motivated by, and then prioritize your arguments to address the objectives that you are pursuing. So one more poll question here. Would love to take a moment to hear from you. What metrics do you or your organization typically use to demonstrate the impact of your HR investments? So this is an open response, so we'll leave a little bit more time here than on the other questions, but I would love to hear some feedback from you all. What types of ways do you tend to substantiate or demonstrate the impact of an HR investment or investment request? Not only what you'd like to be doing, but literally what you tend to do. What is common? What do you see works? And the goal here is, just trying to understand, again, what are common metrics, because I've seen, in fact, in this next slide, I'll highlight a lot of the things we look at today are those that are more easily measured, but not necessarily high-value areas. There are a few, somebody just made a point, there are a few musts that are really table stakes, but that can be difficult. So you can close this here, the poll, and I'll move on. Kat, thank you for that. And as I said, we'll capture any insights that come through and share those in the follow-up, depending on what was shared. But if you think, the point I'm making is, let's think about the whole universe of potential metrics on this 2x2 matrix. One is level of effort, low on the top, high on the bottom, which means more difficult at the high effort side, obviously. And then on the x-axis here, low value versus high value. And I think we need to really be careful not to only do the easy analysis, but we need to do what's worth it. We need to make sure that the juice is worth the squeeze, so to speak. So how can we take our metrics to the next level? I think oftentimes we'll do common measurements, but those that are shallow. And as I mentioned here a moment ago, the metaphor of the juice isn't worth the squeeze. So in most cases, we need to avoid low value, high effort metrics, obviously. And then those that are high value and high effort, that's still okay. They're worth the effort. And in some cases, there are metrics that are relatively lower effort, but higher value. And so in many worlds, often I see common metrics, for example, in this area, and we need to do as much as we can to shift them to the high value vertical so that allows us to prioritize them even if they're high effort. So I think an argument against a metric to say that's difficult should be really challenged in most cases to make sure that obviously most good analysis is difficult. The first time is always, in most cases, the most difficult. But once we start down that path, once we have some experience, once we have some exposure to those more difficult, higher value metrics, it can become inspirational because you now find better ways to be efficient in those bits of analysis. I think about it like, mountain climbing. So because the mountain is tall, doesn't mean, it's not a reason we shouldn't climb it. In fact, what was it, Kennedy, who said, we don't do these things because they are easy, but because they are hard. The whole point is to achieve big things. And if it were easy, everybody would have done it. So I don't want us to be scared of things that are high value and high effort. The other thing I want us to be careful of being concerned about, and I hear this a lot, especially in our space, is we think that other departments, other disciplines have all the data, right? They have all the information. And since our discipline, our function deals with people, it's much more difficult, almost impossible to do any sort of real analysis connected to people. And the thing I have noticed is that when people are involved, obviously it's more complicated, but it's not impossible. In fact, everywhere, every department, every model has a risk, and risk makes it imperfect. There's no perfect information out there. Even finance, for example, will have a model that is imperfect and includes some of those risk analysis. So there's a quote from this 20th century statistician that I love that says, remember that all models are wrong. The practical question to ask is, how wrong do they have to be to not be useful? And so that is a mindset of that perfect information doesn't exist, right? Neither does perfect analysis. And so remembering that allows us to know that even in our domain that doesn't have a reputation for precision and accuracy, we can still handle risk and uncertainty in our analysis. And so just because we're in HR, we don't need to avoid uncertainty. That can be exacerbated by the fact that humans are involved, but we can embrace it and account for it in our analysis. And the value can be, more precise and less precise at different stages of analysis. But sometimes being really logical and being clear about what we're doing can be helpful. So, for example, there's this continuum of value we can talk about where we say the faster you get your new hires to work, it relates to onboarding, means they can become productive more quickly. So there's a time to productivity point. Then they have more access to the knowledge, the more value they provide, the more value they feel. There's a more valued workforce. The more value they feel, the more loyal they become, the longer they stay. That connects to turnover, attrition, longevity. And then all of that contributes to cost savings and opportunities that can be captured, because obviously the more savings you have, the more latitude for your business to grow and feed this continuum. So let me now explain a few examples. Let's make this real. I think we've been talking sort of conceptual. I want to make this real. And these are some real examples that I've heard in real settings that I want to challenge us on. So on the thought of going deeper with our analysis, what do I mean by that? So there are 4 layers to this. I'll call it good, better, best, and bestest, just to be silly. Gives us an opportunity to demonstrate. So number 1, it's great to quantify the activity. And I see this a lot in terms of metrics that are communicated commonly. Is number 1, we've seen, for example, here, Franklin Covey content use double. Okay? But I think that by itself won't inspire investment from a diverse audience, right? They won't necessarily appreciate what that means or outcomes or impacts there. So we have to take it a step further. So I think a better way to approach this would say, convert that to financial metrics. For example, if you think about what content consumption doubling means mathematically, it also means our content cost per hour has decreased by 50%. That is a simple conversion of that ratio to the financial metrics. So if you find yourself talking a lot about individual completions, in many cases, a simple mindset shift can change it to framing it as a financial improvement. Again, hitting on the number one most difficult audience of the financial partners that we have within the business. But I think we can take that even a step further. So for example, here, correlating what you have seen to outcomes. Now, of course, this is more difficult. I don't mean to pretend it's easy, but I think it's a much more ideal outcome. So if you think too about, we've seen better leadership outcomes in terms of user surveys and leader retention, for example. That then can start to say, not just are users satisfied, but does it impact the business? Are we having better outcomes because of this leadership training, this improvement in consumption of leadership training? And then lastly, from a bestest perspective, and again, I say that tongue in cheek, is to value those outcomes. And so we know from the perspective of leadership improvement translates to a certain improvement in worker engagement, retention, and productivity, which equates to a certain financial impact, which can be estimated or even directly measured. And so helping our audience through this journey to land at valuing the outcomes of your initiatives is much more advantageous and has a much better effect than just talking only about content consumption, right? Content consumption by itself is great, but we have to help take people down that journey so that they can understand where we're going, how we're getting there, and why that's defensible. I'd like to share two more quick examples of this just to help drive the point home. This one relates to simplifying the learning experience, a common goal, a common initiative, but maybe we can shift that up this spectrum, right? Converting that to financial metrics. For example, there are many ways that simplifying the learning experience can help drive business value, but one of them is preventing wasted time searching and starting to measure or estimate even the hours that are saved in a year, not to mention just frustration and satisfaction, but actual real time and savings in terms of that. And then knowing that workers are more engaged and productive when they avoid low value add activities. They feel more inspired and they can get more things done in less time. So that again starts to connect it to outcomes. And then the valuing the outcomes. Workers collectively prevented a certain amount of hours wasted time searching. That equates to not only hours, but also dollars or whatever currency. And that workers report more satisfaction and inspiration and faster skill building. This directly addresses corporate agility goals, for example. So you can start to connect the learning initiatives to the business outcomes they can help drive. And then the last one is around creating a more of a learning culture. And so that then, for example, as a third example here, saying, well, not just the learning culture for the sake of a learning culture. Most in an organization don't appreciate that, right? At least the way that we would. What we can highlight is that maybe that's improved worker engagement and by a certain number of percentage points. You can start to measure these things. Then the better engagement we're seeing from a learning culture also shows more optional learning correlates to strong performance reviews. In fact, we've done studies here at Degreed with partners and third parties, with customers, a variety of approaches, and we see a really consistent theme around workers that use Degreed are incredibly more impactful, more higher performance oriented workers. And that could either mean that Degreed created these high performers or Degreed supports the high performers with a capital H and a capital P or even a lowercase high performer, but still giving you an opportunity to then value those outcomes, because then that improved learning culture is driving better engagement, stronger performance reviews, better turnover dynamics. And then we know that even if we improve employee retention by 1%, highlighting the number of workers that even is valued at a certain dollar figure or certain financial amount. So just again, driving home a few examples, and you can think about the Kirkpatrick model, et cetera, as another way to think about this. But going beyond activity, going beyond just simple financial metrics, and getting more to correlating outcomes and valuing the outcomes, I think is a great way to go deeper in the analysis. And in doing that, that can become components for a business case, right? And as we know, most full-fledged business cases have multiple common sections, executive summaries and problem statements and options and alternatives and risks and investments. If we think in particular about this impact analysis, which is usually the most difficult, especially the quantitative side with calculations and figures, that helps us focus on the areas that are most difficult, also within the umbrella of all areas. And focusing on the quantitative, what we do here at Degreed is often talk about how Degreed addresses two fundamental value pools. It addresses the value across the employee lifecycle related to people and productivity. What does that mean? Well, it touches on retention, productivity, onboarding, upskilling, efficiency, and others. The second value pool is around systems and resources, and that helps us think about the cost savings, the process efficiencies, the resource reduction. And this, as you think about these big picture items, it helps you break it down into smaller buckets and then make it more tangible, more understandable. And so now we've talked a little bit about knowing your audience, right? Talked about really understanding who they are, what motivates them. We've talked about how to adjust our message for the different audience members, as well as how to go deeper with our analysis. But now I want to spend kind of the second half of our time talking a little bit about how to tell a story. Now, this is, I think, a little bit less quantitative and a little bit more, storytelling oriented. If any of you are writers or screenplay, authors or anything like that, would love you to chime in to challenge or support any of this as well in the chat or with me separately. I'd love to kind of go deep on some of these things. But I see a challenge in storytelling, kind of weaving all of these components together in a way that is helpful. And so we know, again, that a business case is basically data-driven persuasion, as I mentioned at the beginning. And those of us in HR and learning intuitively understand the impact of what it is that we're doing and its role on the business, the outcomes that we spoke about earlier. But most of our stakeholders don't see these same connections, right? Instead, stories can be a natural vehicle for persuasion. And why is that? Well, good storytelling requires we know our audience. To tell a good story, you probably will adjust it. You should adjust it, right, for different groups. I think simply like if you're telling a story, a joke, for example, or telling a story about your day, you might tell your best friend a different version of that story or a different level of detail or a different shared understanding than you would maybe your children or your grandmother or a stranger. And that's okay because you're adjusting your story, to the audience. And so some stories are individual examples of things that have happened. Those are really meaningful. But also when I think about storytelling overall, sometimes having a cohesive approach to capturing our data and sharing that to an audience can really help us do that in a careful and impactful way. And so we know these well-crafted stories create a common ground. They demonstrate transformation over time. And in turn, transformation creates emotion. It drives emotion. I've also seen the experience had the experience personally that emotion is a powerful force in memory, right? We remember facts more than we remember feelings. At least I do. You can tell me, mention a facility or an event or someone's name, and I'll often have a very positive or maybe a negative emotion that I don't even understand. It's like, why do I feel that way about that place or that person? And it takes me some moment to remember a situation that was great or terrible that might have created a deep-seated kind of sticky emotion in me that is fascinating to me. So the good news is if that's how we operate as humans, then we can use that to our advantage, right? We can leverage that, knowing that humans are emotional creatures on some level, some more than others, but we can connect with the emotions of individuals, more so than you can remember facts and bullet lists of presentations, right? This presentation notwithstanding, of course. We remember the feelings, the emotions of a situation. And so, we talk about a story a lot. What is a story? Okay, so let's do a quick double click here. Story, obviously, there are a lot of definitions of story. You could Google storylining and see a variety of approaches to telling a story, but essentially they contain a few common elements, right? There's a beginning, there's some sort of spark, some inciting incident, there's a protagonist and an antagonist potentially, there's a midpoint, a climax, maybe back and forth action, and then there's a conclusion, an end, where the world is different. There is a transformation. Something has happened. And obviously, if you're deep into being an author or actually telling stories, some of these will be familiar. But knowing this can help us then connect that to a business context. There's an analytical storytelling approach I want to share with you today. And it basically covers these three levels of this pyramid. The what, the current situation that needs to be addressed, the why, the root causes, the project impacts if it's not addressed, and also the how, the plan to address the situation and root causes. This is essentially known, at least in how I was taught, the situation, the complication, and the resolution. You could also think about it like the context, the problem, and the solution. And so what does this mean, right? This situation, complication, resolution, SCR, if you will, let's explain what these mean in a little bit more detail. First, the situation is what's happening now. How would you frame the foundation for the situation? In this part of the story, you want to have the audience sort of nodding their head. You want to be sharing with them something that's familiar, something that explains their situation, that describes where they are currently, that they already know and accept as fact. This helps you frame the conversation, helps you limit it in scope and scale, and helps you then have a platform on which to have the rest of the conversation. The next thing is the complication, right? And the complication is, why is this a challenge? Why is this still an issue? Why is it hard to solve? So something that highlights the challenge that you're facing at the moment, why you need to do something about it. And then lastly, the resolution. So how do we meet this challenge? What's the suggestion? What's the solution? How do we move forward? The action required to solve the problem or capture an opportunity. In doing that, there are two words here that I put in purple that are nice conjunctions to make it really clear. The word but and the word so. And if you think about what that is, you have a situation, but here's the problem, so here's what we need to do about it. Now, what I'm going to do is walk through an example of this that is actually publicly available online. A consulting firm, McKinsey, you might be familiar with, they did a project for the United States Postal Service here in the U.S. that is a few years old now, but because the Postal Service has some requirements to make these studies publicly available, it's interesting to use that information as a way to decompose what this story looks like in real life from a high-end consulting company like McKinsey. And this is publicly available. I've cited it down here. But what you can see is that the United States Postal Service, this was from a few years ago. Obviously, I think these themes still hold true. The situation is they're experiencing unprecedented losses because of volume declines, increased retiree health benefits funding, and lower than expected cost savings. That's the situation. And this is literally from their complicated deck, distilling it down into the situation, complication, resolution. The complication is if we do nothing, the losses are only going to get worse. We have these mega trends. We have competitive forces. We have an e-diversification challenge that will accelerate our declines of volume, competition, legal and regulatory requirements that mean we cannot get away from our commitments. And so what do we do about this? The United States Postal Service must do four things. We need to drive revenue. We need to increase productivity. We need to reduce costs and so forth. That'll help us then see how this in real life you can use the situation, complication, resolution framework to connect the dots for you. Now, what's interesting is when I was building this, looking back, I actually used this framework to set up our talk today, right? Remember at the beginning, I highlighted that the people agenda has a certain situation. That's basically the situation. The complication, again, I use the word but here to introduce the complication. So despite these advancements, we still have some challenges. And then the resolution is highlighting how we can think about our approach and tell the story differently. So what does all this mean? And so I'm going to wrap here in just a couple of moments and leave an opportunity for going through the Q&A, or even if anybody wants to speak up and answer some questions, we can do that as well, or ask some questions. In summary, I would argue that really better business-focused language, analysis, understanding our audience and everything that is there, going deeper with our work, plus better and more structured storytelling, at the end of the day can help us be more persuasive in our roles, help us then translate those HR initiatives that we really believe in, for which we're pursuing approval, translate those to more persuasive analysis and to better outcomes. So I'm going to stop sharing at the moment so I can see the chat and think about some of any Q&A that might come in, but definitely would love to open it up for questions. So let me, looking back at the questions, I'll go over this just kind of in order here. It looks like a couple of questions around a few examples of the bliss and what's worth the effort. I hope we were able to do that through the good, better, bestest sort of frame. Please challenge me if I didn't feel like it addressed those, and we can explore those a little bit more detail. I will tell a story too. I did a study for a big financial institution that is a customer of Degreed, and they were really interested in understanding what is the value of this thing. Like, how can we go beyond some of the conventional approaches? And so after a period of time, with them, we worked very closely to do some analysis, and we found a bunch of awesome activity and behavioral elements that are kind of completion-oriented but still interesting. But again, that doesn't really convince a diverse audience. There were 4 key things we found at the end, above and beyond completions and behavioral and activities, that were really compelling. One was we by doing all these, actually, we split the organization into, over time, folks that used Degreed and folks that did not. And I mentioned some of this a moment ago, but we see the 4 key insights there with people that used Degreed were much more likely to have a high performance review. They were much more likely, number 2, to experience less turnover. They also are much more likely to be engaged from a company engagement survey perspective. And they had a formal engagement survey process that we were able to segment into and look at these 2 groups to compare and contrast over time. And then number 4, they were much more likely to experience internal mobility or to be promoted. And so that was a really clear view that, gosh, there were a lot of different ways to be successful, and we were proud to see that Degreed was helping drive so much of their work. And the thing that happened was so much of this great work. And so I think, though, a skeptical audience would say, well, how do you know which one caused the other? It's a chicken and egg or causation correlation problem. And I think it's important to note that, academics spend their whole career trying to assess causation. So it's not something that's simple, and certainly not something that we can unpack in the session here today. But the good news is either, the initiative in this case that we were studying, Degreed, helps support high performers on one end, or it creates high performers on the other end. I think the truth is it's somewhere in between. There are examples of both. But in either case, I think it's a really compelling and convincing argument that the initiative was really impactful and really effective. And when you get so many different measures pointing the same direction at the same thing, you can start to feel like these different facets of an object make the shape. You start to understand the shape of an object. Looking through some examples, cost reduction, tech stack, team member satisfaction. Anyone feel free to keep adding questions or to speak up if there's a particular thing we want to address over the next few minutes. Yes, the session is being recorded and will be shared post-event. and the slide that has the bliss and tell us what those numbers and letters on the quadrant stand for. Oh, I see. That one, the number there was just to map what is common, right? The blue circles are ones that, based on my experience, roughly, that I see are very common type metrics that tend to fall toward the lower value. It's meant to be just a conceptual overlay to show the difference between the common metrics versus those that are more outcome, more high value focused. And then I see another question: with each of the stakeholders have been able to identify, my question's geared toward those most tenured. Does anyone have an example that worked with gaining buy-in more quickly? That sounds like maybe one for the group to chime in on. I mean, in my experience, the biggest way to gain buy-in quickly is to really understand what success looks like from an audience member's perspective, from your stakeholders' perspective. Sometimes they make that really clear and obvious in stating their top 3 goals for the quarter or for the year. And if that's true, and if you see learning as really HR as an enabler, a driver of change, then understanding how you can connect the dots between an HR initiative and what it is they're trying to accomplish. So I talked to a company this morning who is really trying to really better understand their skills and better understand the skills they have, the skills they need, and how they're building those skills. And that's a C-level initiative. Like literally the CEO, it's one of his top 3, her top 3 initiatives in this year, and they've been working on this for years. And so really showing that one is a people-related initial agenda item, obviously. But the good news is you can obviously connect to that and highlight why this isn't just a brute force effort of mapping jobs to skills or something like that. You have to think about things differently in order to accomplish that. So knowing what their goals are is one of the best ways, and their fears, their hopes, how they're rewarded, how they're paid, what their individual hopes are. That can give you some hypotheses around what to focus on in the conversation. That's what I've seen as a way to get buy-in established quickly. Somebody's asked about a copy of the slides. Yes, we'll share those in PDF afterwards in the follow-up. Speak to the value of construction workers. Oh, yeah, okay. So I think, Joanne, interesting question. I think in many settings, obviously different types of workers have different motivations. Now, I think in my perception of construction workers is they're practical, they're hands-on, and historically most of their learning has been situated around training and compliance. But if you think about how they actually learn, much of how they learn is on the job, right? And I would argue that many people I know in this space love being mentors, love being teachers, love being instructors so that they can learn through that and they can help others learn in the way that they've learned. And so if they see, again, I'm learning bias given my role here, but if you think about positioning learning as a way to accelerate their career, a way to help them be safer, a way to help them be more influential with their peers and sharing and adding value according to that, that can be a way to frame for individual workers a great experience, helping drive their discovery, helping drive their curiosities in, for example, next generation construction techniques, or using a new tool, or stories of success. Because most folks in construction that I know don't want to be seen as not understanding one aspect of construction, even if it's not their primary one, right? So if you can tap into that incentive by saying, look, we can give you an opportunity to quickly research a topic and get up to speed really quickly on your own time, on your mobile device, in the flow of work, whatever that means, then you can add value in a new way by helping them be more effective, have better reputation internally by getting up to speed quickly. I think so much of it is understanding the individuals, their motivation, and even asking them, what does success look like for you? Where can you be well served? Where do you struggle? What do you need? Not even related to HR or learning, but what do you need in your career? And then of the things that they share, a subset of those are ones that you can influence, support, or even directly address. Including true decision makers when the right people are in the room, Yeah, I think that's a great point. Streamlining onboarding tasks is really important for us. Sarita mentioned the challenge I have is the volume is so low when I translate to time savings, it doesn't show high impact. So I think with onboarding is interesting. And when I use onboarding, I really mean not just the formal onboarding time, which often is very short, right? Hours or days, sometimes weeks for a really structured program. But the time it takes as well to go up to maybe 90% productive or 100% productive, that can help you understand the time it takes for people to climb that whole learning curve. And really what you start to do is you replace interrupting your boss, bugging your neighbor, bothering your buddy with actual self-directed, independent learning. Now, obviously, you're always going to have some on-the-job learning where you're required to interrupt somebody and ask questions. I think that's a stretch to believe that would totally go away, but rather to the degree you can take the edges off of some of those, or giving people the opportunity to independently onboard. And really, there are studies that show that getting someone fully up to speed in a job where they are 100% independent, 100% productive of their theoretical maximum can take up to 2 to 3 years, not 2 to 3 hours or 2 to 3 weeks, as we all probably know. That matters for new hires. It matters for transfers. So I think reframing the conversation from just the formal onboarding, which I presume might be the focus there, to the getting up to speed in a role or getting up to full productivity in a role can be helpful, because then you have a much longer arc to deal with, and the times can be impactful. See, there's also some questions in chat. I'll scroll through some of these. Learning investments also being used to determine the learner's accountability in terms of the amount of time we put in a return service contract with employees. So, Marietta, I might need some more context. Let me read it again and see if I follow. The learning investments also being used to determine the learner's accountability in terms of the amount we put in a return service contract. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by return service contract. So maybe I'll be able to potentially answer that offline, or if you can give any more context about the instrument in particular, or maybe I'm not familiar with that, if that's a common one. I'm happy to give you some thoughts if I can get a little bit more context there, Marietta. I'm going to scroll back through the chat as well and see what we see here. Some questions about the poll question, some comments there. Some folks look at customer satisfaction, product usage. I agree, product usage and is a sort of a relatively easy one. There's a good table stakes one. I wouldn't necessarily always argue that product usage is the panacea or is the ideal end state of that good, better, bestest. Try to think about what product usage drives. What does that mean if they're actually consuming the training in a way that you think it does? How can you spoon feed your audience so that they can really understand and sort of have the whole experience of the discovery that you want them to realize? I think the spoon feeding metaphor is a good one, because many times, at least in this space, I see people laying out a recipe, right? Like, here are all the pieces and maybe even the directions to create this meal, and you're expecting your audience to sort of do the work to have a eating experience, right? But I think it's much more effective. It's also harder work on our part, but to actually cook the meal and spoon feed them the food, so you can have them taste exactly what you're trying to have them taste, instead of, for example, throwing data on a set of slides, hoping your audience can interpret that for themselves. Rather, take ownership of that, create that storyline, the thread, and spoon feed them what you want them to understand, even if they're smart, even if they're sophisticated, even if they're senior. In fact, especially if they're senior and smart and sophisticated, many times you have to frame the story really carefully so that they have that exact experience that you want them to have. Recently.com is a great resource to capture CSAT. Okay. A few examples of the blitz. Hopefully I've done that. The poll results. Okay, dropping questions in the Q&A. Yes, and the recording will be made available in follow-ups, as well as a PDF of the slides if you'd like to have them there. Other contributing factors, partners involved, how do you isolate the ROI? Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Lily. Isolating the ROI is obviously a challenge. And I think, again, sometimes there's an expectation that we are 100% certain at the extent and not only the direction, but also the extent of ROI. I think it's more important to think about the impact, think about multiple signals so that you can increase your level of confidence in a result. I mean, in many cases, if your objective is to make a decision, right, you're trying to determine, is it worth it to make this decision? You don't actually need to prove to the 10th decimal point what an outcome was. Rather, you need to be more sure than not that a path is the correct path to take. So I wouldn't necessarily set the bar as being certain as to the extent of a particular outcome, rather helping characterize the decision by saying, look, this is worth it. Here are signals we see, ways that we can be defensible and conservative and transparent to show that it is worth it to keep doing this thing, or to start doing this thing, or to stop doing this thing, whatever that might be. So I don't think the goal should be to be, perfect precision. One, because that doesn't exist, and it's a huge mountain to climb. And as soon as people are involved, obviously it gets messy. But it's not impossible. So recognizing some risk involved, being open about risk factors and risk reductions, and being really inclusive as the type of impact that we can help drive, I think can start to, again, paint the picture of sort of, I think, of a shape with a bunch of different facets, and each different perspective of analysis is a different face of the shape. And you get enough faces built, you can be pretty confident you know what the shape of this thing looks like. You know the size of it. You know the orientation of it. And that can be a way that you can help develop the not as much isolate per se, but help develop confidence in the ROI of a given initiative or a program. How do you navigate having to re-explain data again and again? I spend a lot of time explaining the metrics for how we gathered them versus actually looking at the impact. Yeah, that's a great question. I actually would argue in some cases, it's very situational, but maybe take the approach to say, we'll do two things today. One is I'm going to give you the insights that we've seen, and then number two, if you want to stay around, I'll walk you through the detail for how we got there. Maybe that second phase is much more suited toward an analyst type or someone on the team who wants to get down and dirty in the data. The other approach is to set expectations before the meeting, to say we're not going to cover the whole process, or do a pre-meeting with the analyst to get them to buy off on the validity of the approach, so that you can say, Sue, you and I, you can announce, Sue, the analyst, has approved this as legitimate and correct and accurate. So you can then get to the insights and the decisions you want to drive from that to hold people accountable instead of questioning particular metrics. I think that's an awesome question. And I think Lily made the point there might still be some skepticism in the project initiative itself. But I think also just, getting some approval from an analyst or someone like that beforehand can be quite handy to take the edge off of that. So I'm conscious of time. I know we just have a minute or two left. I'm skimming here the questions in the chat to see if there are any key ones remaining that I can kind of speak to. Training contracts for employees, and I think there are different ways to think about learning. Right? Historically, learning was really a training and compliance-oriented tool that was focused on completions, focused on behaviors, and then more recently we've shifted into this experience layer where it's focused on discovery, focused on engagement, and obviously, the huge part of what Degreed sees as the value proposition of a learning experience platform. And we're starting to see this shift to more capabilities, more skill building, more outcomes that are being measured. And so depending on the training contracts, I think there's an official element that's compulsory and required, that's sometimes explicit. and the discovery and the outcome-oriented one. So I think we need to have a multi-layered approach to making sure we deliver what's required from a training perspective, those compulsory trainings, but also deliver what people want to find, how they can self-discover, how they can share, interact socially, so that they can be well-rounded and actually build the skills that are interesting to them in their career. So hopefully that speaks to some of that. Now, I see we're at time. I really appreciate you all staying on and listening to this stage. It was lovely to have met. We'll look forward to following up asynchronously online as we send you emails and so forth. But again, I really appreciate your time. Thank you all.